Hello everyone and welcome. So for today's lesson, we're really going to start moving into the central part of the Cold War and talk about probably the most intense period of it, the period known as the Cuban Missile Crisis, the couple days where the world was really the closest it had ever been to nuclear warfare, a full-on nuclear apocalypse potentially. So please title your notes for today, the Cuban Missile Crisis. So it's important to understand that this event is really going to be one of the defining moments of the Kennedy presidency. It's probably the moment historians look at the most with admiration, commending President Kennedy for really handling this international threat. So to understand what's really going on in Cuba, it's important to understand the historical context of it. So during the 1950s, the Cuban people largely hated their government and the dictator who was in power at the time. So a revolution ensues led by a man named Fidel Castro, who will ultimately become the leader of Cuba for several decades. So after Castro took power in Cuba, he also became something of a dictator. In his governmental moves, he takes over American owned sugar mills, refineries, and largely becomes a very oppressive leader. So, President Eisenhower, who was president at the time, puts a trade embargo on Cuba. If you recall from earlier in the course, an embargo basically means that nothing's really going in or out of the country from the United States. So, of course, with no option left, Castro turns to the other world power at the time, the Soviet Union. So, just to show you where we are now, we're transitioning from the Eisenhower administration to the Kennedy administration. Again, in United States history too, you'll really explore the actual presidencies of these men. For the sake of this course, though, we're just thematically covering the Cold War itself. So, a plan was hatched that has now been referred to as the Bay of Pigs invasion. This plan was actually put together during Eisenhower's administration, but it's actually going to be implemented under Kennedy. So in 1961, the United States financially supports anti Castro and therefore anti communist rebels in Cuba. This is very similar to what we saw in Korea. The Soviet Union basically financing North Korea. Here you have the United States financing rebels to go against Castro and ultimately the communists. So they're going to push for an invasion of Cuba near the Bay of Pigs, but it's an absolute disaster. The rebels get very handily put down, and the United States really balks and doesn't get militarily involved. So really, like in terms of analyzing Kennedy's presidency, this is usually like the dark mark, what historians argue is like the low point of his time in office. The United States really is forced to back down, and it's a Soviet victory in that sense. The rebels are humiliated, they're defeated really with no issues at all. But the U.S. interference in obviously financing these rebels, but also the fact that they aren't willing to fully get involved, inspires Nikita Khrushchev, the new leader of the Soviet Union, to build missile silos in Cuba. It's important to understand that at the time, the United States had missile silos in Italy, Turkey, and other nations in Western Europe that would be easily able to, hit the Soviet Union. So now the Soviets are trying to create missile silos that are close to the United States. Basically, this would be leverage against the U.S. if the Cold War ever truly turned hot and these two superpowers went to war with each other. So just to show you, this is the Bay of Pigs right here. You can see that this is where the invasion is actually going to be taking place. So just to show you this primary source very quickly, this is from Fidel Castro, and it just goes to show how no one was really being sincere or honest at the time. He says, Cuba did not and does not intend to be in the middle of a conflict between the East and the West. Our problem is above all our national sovereignty. Cuba does not mean to get involved in the Cold War, which you'll see in just a second is totally dishonest. So the period of the Cuban Missile Crisis is often referred to as the days when the Earth stood still, patiently waiting to see if this was going to emerge into an actual confrontation between these two powers. So, under Kennedy's orders, American spy planes were flying over Cuba and they identified missile silos there, basically giving the U.S. the evidence that it needed that there actually were, in fact, nuclear weapons in Cuba. So, JFK is presented with a very, very difficult decision. Does he invade Cuba? Could that risk immediately going to war with the Soviet Union, who was their ally? Do they bomb Cuba? Same potential outcome. Do they do nothing and leave missiles so close to their southern border? So he orders a blockade, specifically a quarantine. And he uses the term quarantine because it allows essential goods to go into Cuba, but doesn't actually attack or like completely cut them off. Khrushchev declares that this is really an act of war, and over these couple days, it's going to be negotiations to see what happens next. Literally, people were waiting to see if nuclear warfare was going to take effect. Ultimately, it becomes one of the most defining moments of the Cold War. Soviet submarines and ships meet U.S. submarines and ships in the open sea, and basically they're patiently waiting to see if either one attacks, and ultimately the USSR caves and turns around. So just to show you, this is the U.S. intelligence map. You can see that this is where the missile silos were located. This is probably a better image. This is an aerial view of a forest in Cuba, and you can see that where these two circles are, these would be the actual missiles being transported. Here is a briefing of President Kennedy with his military advisors being told about the missiles in Cuba. And this is what one of the ships during the actual quarantine would have looked like. This is one of the most famous quotes from the Cold War era. It's actually from Dean Rusk, who was the Secretary of State at the time. He said, "We're eyeball to eyeball with the enemy, and I think the other fellow just blinked." So basically, you're staring down the enemy, staring down the potential for nuclear warfare, and the other guy turns around. I can't emphasize enough how close the world came to full-on war between the U.S. and Soviet Union. It came down really to three guys in a Soviet tank deciding if they should attack or not. Two of them gave the go-ahead, and one of them refused, and it's actually that person who prevents an attack from taking place. Just to end off for today, this primary source takes a peek inside the Cold War and really emphasizes how dramatic of an event this is. Just listen to this. In the face of an air attack on Cuba and in the face of the probability of a ground attack, it was certainly possible, and I would say probable, that a Cuban sergeant or Soviet officer in a missile silo, without authority from Moscow, would have launched one or more of those intermediate-range missiles equipped with a nuclear warhead against one or more of the cities on the East Coast of the United States. Now, we live close to New York City, and just think about how horrifying of a reality that would be. Think of the images that you saw of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This is about 20 years later, so the nuclear weapons would have been even more deadly at the time. It really is just horrifying to think. Believe it or not, we're almost done with this chapter. We only have 2 more lessons left. We're going to first talk about the Vietnam War, and then we'll wrap things up by talking about the thawing of tensions and the end of the Cold War.